It's my understanding you're working on a book about post-Civil War segregation of Southern churches. Tell us about that research. What exactly have you been doing? How are you gathering that information, and why do it?
I think the how I gather information is a really interesting question because just by the nature of the project, post-war black churches didn't generate a lot of formal records for the first several years. And that's actually kind of shaped the historiography on it. Most scholars, when they write about the separation of black and white churchgoers that happened in the South following the Civil War, kind of fast forward to the late 1870s, because that's when we have ample documentation. And they tell a story with which I agree that, in general, black churchgoers left white churches, white-controlled churches, I should say, almost unanimously. But that unanimity really only appears if you skip forward 12 years. And if you do slow motion, you see that folks left at different paces and different places for different reasons. And even within the same congregation, some folks left within a few months at the end of the war. Some folks waited a decade before leaving. And so that kind of variation, which you get when you look at a shorter, more detailed time frame, that's what I'm going after. So how does one do that when the sources don't exist? In general, I have to work from the records of white churches pretty frequently. But there are also observers, northern missionaries, black and white, who give a lot of good records. Trying to cobble together a story from as many different sources as I can.
When it comes to actual records, I understand that you looked through the congregational records of hundreds of North Carolina and Virginia churches from both Baptist and Methodist congregations. What did you see in those records? What details were in there, and why did you decide to focus on Baptist and Methodist congregations?
Well, that's where the people are, is the basic reason I'm focusing. I try to work with other congregations too. I try to get pretty full coverage, but Baptist and Methodist are the main denominations with black adherents, which is why they're the main place that I pay attention. And I had to do at least two states because the denominational makeup of North Carolina and Virginia, and of every state, is different. In Virginia, for example, 86% of the black churchgoers belong to a Baptist church. It's just not the case in North Carolina. It's much more evenly balanced, maybe a little tilt Methodist. So I had to look at both traditions. I don't know how detailed a recounting of the kinds of sources. I get real into it, but there's a real difference between Baptist and Methodist sources. Is it appropriate for me to?
Well, sure. Let's hear about some of the interesting things you found in the rolls.
Well, I mean, the irony is that Baptists are theoretically really Congregationalist. I mean, their polity is radically Congregationalist, except they have phenomenal centralized archives. North Carolina Baptist Historical Collection housed at Wake Forest and the Virginia Baptist Historical Collection housed at University of Richmond are amazing. They have hundreds of minute books from churches dating all the way back to the 18th century. Methodists, which are amazingly centralized as a denomination, have terrible congregational records because they have these quarterly reports, which are sort of OCD magnificent in their level of uniformity. Each church answers a series of questions every quarter and submits it, and then they're published, aggregated on an annual basis. Sort of like magnificent for big picture, but you don't get this fine-grained stuff you get for the Baptists. So I'm basically addicted to Baptist records, and I go to these state repositories all the time, and the fine-grained stories you get are really fantastic.
What are some of the details? What are some of the things that you do find when you dive into those records?
One of the things you notice is that the scholarly story of black solidarity and thought and action following emancipation is much too simple a story. For example, we'll find churches, scores of them, in which 6 months after the war, the scholarly stereotype of black separation seems to be unfolding when a church will dismiss 20, 30, 40 black members to form a separate black church. But then if you look closely at the records, you notice 80 black members stayed in the church. So what's that about, right? And some of those members, a third of them stay in for at least 2 years. 5, 6, 7% stay in until they die. I mean, there's very different kinds of stories.
So all of this that we're talking about kind of goes back to this book. Is there a targeted published date? Is there a title? Do we know anything about maybe this is as abstract as the records of the Methodist Church? Do we have any details on the book yet?
Well, I'm shooting for a full manuscript by the end of summer 2014, so a little over a year off. I play with the title. I'm not sure of the title right now. like most scholars, I wanted to assign great ideological significance to Black churchgoers' decisions in the immediate post-war period. I mean, the idea of Black nationalism and looking out from slavery, Black solidarity is the main scholarly story. So I wanted to find a way to talk about these ideological divisions that might be revealed by different ecclesiastical choices. But I actually don't think it's all ideological anymore. People don't always act on their ideological commitments. Sometimes life is hard. Sometimes you worry that if you act on your ideological commitment, you'll lose your job. Sometimes there's inertia. Sometimes you want to stay where you're comfortable. And so I don't see the really clear ideological foundation for the decisions of these men and women anymore. Kind of see emancipation as a predicament, just like slavery was a predicament, with lots of problems that were almost individual. And so I'll try to think of some way to talk about emancipation as a predicament.
So that means there have been some surprises in the research.
Sure. I mean, the big surprise is just that so many Black churchgoers were reluctant to leave. There's a very small literature on this, the ecclesiastical part in general, but the overall Reconstruction literature, I mean, the big story is solidarity and separation. And it's just not the church story.
Now, you've written an abstract regarding some of this research, and you wrote that in general, scholars have characterized the Reconstruction era as a time of racial solidarity in Southern churches, when in fact, many Black Southerners were uncertain in this predicament that you mentioned about how they wanted to exercise those new freedoms. Why do you think scholars might have glossed over this part of the Reconstruction story?
I mean, part of it is a wholesome corrective to generations of really short-sighted racist scholarship. I mean, part of it is a wonderful corrective to what we used to call the Dunning School, this school of thought that Reconstruction was a tragic experiment that was doomed to failure because Black Southerners weren't capable of self-government. And I really appreciate that since the 1960s, scholars have picked up on W.B. Du Bois's 1935 Black Reconstruction and talked about Black Southerners as political actors who are making decisions that reflect their own self-interest. I love that. But it's just not always true that folks always act in their own self-interest and always act rationally. So I appreciate the corrective, but we have to find a way to talk about the fact that people don't always do what we think they're going to do, or they should do, or they want to remember that they did 100 years later. So I think that part of it is just that scholarly corrective. Part of it is political. It's much easier to talk about moral agents who always make the right choices than it is to talk about people caught up in stuff that is confusing and sometimes involves false choices.
This is obviously a topic with many layers to it then. Why is this what has grabbed you? Why is this what you're interested in now?
Partly it's an extension of my first big set of research projects, which was about those forced biracial or multiracial communities before the Civil War, when whites and blacks did go to church together in the South. Sunday morning was not the most segregated hour. I mean, those communities were not equal, they were not egalitarian, but they were multiracial. And then I just expected, right after the Civil War, they would all go away. But I kept reading the church minutes just out of curiosity in the archives for the first project, and I would notice that it didn't always unfold like that. And so anytime one notices that the scholarly record does not correspond to the documentary record, it kind of gets one's juices flowing.
Yeah, it piques the interest. Why is it important for all of us to know and understand this? What relevance does this research have now?
I think that's a great question. And this is one of the beauties and great bits of awkwardness about all primary research, is you can't always tell. But what we can tell is there is a persistent nexus of religion and politics and religion and community identification in the American experience. And this is an example of religion and politics playing out in a way that involves questions of race and racial solidarity and the virtues of integration and kinds of separation. All those questions are still relevant today. How anyone might abstract a particular political program from the book, I'm not certain, but I think it's important at least to to puncture myths that aren't true, on which we base some of our decisions, and also to acknowledge that the present is complicated. Why wasn't the past complicated as well? Why can't we understand the past as complicated as the present?
Well, when it comes to understanding this past, does getting this picture of it change the story of the Reconstruction era?
I think it does. And maybe the best way is to give a little bit of an analogy. The most famous two works on Reconstruction are Eric Foner's 1988 Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, and then Stephen Hahn's Pulitzer Prize-winning Nation Under Our Feet. Both of these tell a story of black political activism. Both of these acknowledge the tragic failure of Reconstruction, white violence, short circuits biracial democracy in the South. I mean, white racial violence short circuits this process. But they want to find a redemptive legacy in all this. And they both point to black churches as these key examples of institution building, black solidarity, black separation, proto-black nationalism in the immediate post-war period. Well, what if that one thing that people point to itself has a complicated history with interracialism sort of all woven into it? I think it does complicate some of our overall narratives of Reconstruction.
Even bringing that to the present day, you know, while there are a number of multiracial, multicultural churches these days, there's still the feeling, the saying that Sunday is still the most segregated day in the South. How are the predominantly black churches of today different than those of this era?
I'm going to answer the first part of your question and not the second, because there is this whole interesting literature on why those racial separations became so entrenched in American culture. And my research is on the process of separation. But then there's a whole new branch of research conducted primarily by sociologists that's on the problem of persistent separation. Why attempts to create multiracial communities so often fail. And they mostly do fail. I mean, Sunday morning is still the most segregated hour. Most multiracial churches shift one way or the other after only a few years. So there is a whole group of 6 or 7 sociologists really committed to kind of answering that question. I don't always engage their work because it's, you know, a different century, a different set of problems, but they have a lot of theories on why it's so hard to unravel this persistent legacy of segregation within the churches.
Do you get to share much of this with students, much of the process, much of what you're understanding as you're teaching?
I do. I mean, I want them to look at some of the records that I look at. And I always ask them, I'll just put a few slides on Blackboard or on PowerPoint, and I'll ask them to reflect on what they think it means. And they will the typical response is, well, gee, if 40% of people are in a couple of years out, 33, 40%, that doesn't seem like total separation. And just to hear them, you know, in this sort of like total fresh, innocent kind of way, say, well, gosh, the numbers don't add up. I've enjoyed, and it's been affirming to me.
Yeah, has that kind of helped shape the research in any way?
I mean, it is interesting because one has to respond to the scholarly community, but I think I've gotten affirmation in my willingness to question some of the scholarly consensus by listening to students.
What else should people understand about your research? Why else is it important for us to grasp?
I want to make cosmic claims right now about its significance. But I think one thing I can just say is questions about race and identity and community are things that we think about a lot at Elon now with our unprecedented commitment to diversity and global engagement. And we need to listen to each other, and we need to understand the complicated reasons that people make decisions. And I think if we think about a complicated situation in Reconstruction in which people made decisions about inclusion, participation in the civic community versus participation in communities of racial solidarity. Yeah, I think maybe we might get some clues about how we can handle some of our own questions of diversity better today.